This video is going to be all about Slavoj Zizek. I've been meaning to do more videos on him because he's probably not only the most relevant philosopher of this day and age, but I also find him very interesting and enjoyable when listening to his ideas and thoughts. This video will outline his reasons for rejecting Jungian psychology, so this video will go into many different concepts and ideas covering Freud, Lacan, Jung, structuralism, and so on. The first aspect of Jungian psychology that Zizek rejects is Jung's concept of libido. Freud thought of libido as sexual energy within the psyche, the currency of life force, eros. Now this sexual energy could be sublimated to other activities such as creativity, work or whatever, but an important emphasis is that it's sexual in origin and reducible to sexual relations, wishes and traumas. Jung used this term libido in a broader sense. For him, libido isn't only etiologically sexuality but life energy, energy in a generalized nature, appetite for life and even different sorts of impulses. The idea of energy for Jung is risen from the view of a polarity of opposites, so Jung used libido in many more ways than Freud. But to clarify, one of the main reasons for Zizek's departure from Jung would be on the matter of energy and that it depends on a pre-existing polarity. For Freud, Lacan and Zizek, the libido is sexual and that does not arise from a polarity of opposites. Hence why Freud sees the pleasure principle based within the id and its instinctive nature before ego development. It's therefore based in instinct, which is when Freud uses the idea of life instinct and death instinct. Zizek says the following: what Jung does is precisely in opposition to Freud. For example, apropos of the notion of libido, for Jung libido is precisely a kind of neutral universal notion, and then you have the concrete forms of libido, different metamorphoses as he says. You have sexual, creative, destructive libido and so on, whereas Freud insists that libido in its concrete existence is irreducibly sexual. So the Althusian title of Freud would be libido and its sexual existence, or whatever. My point is what here? My point is that with Lacan, sexual difference man and woman has to be conceived precisely in terms of this Althusian ant. Man is this universal, woman is this concrete existence, to put it in this way. There are two ways: either we do it this way, man and woman as ideology and ideological state apparatuses, or we do it in this abstract, obscurantist way, man and woman, two polarities, complementing each other, etc. And we are very quickly in some kind of new age obscurantism. I find this quite amusing that a Lacanian like Zizek would call anyone else an obscurantist, and his justification is overly simplified when it comes to Zizek dismissing Jung's idea of libido. Of course Zizek is using the term obscurantist in a specific context here, but still it's rich anyways. To better clarify Zizek's supposed reasoning for disagreeing with Jung is that he holds the premise that on the matter of energy there is a pre-existing polarity. For Freud, Lacan and Zizek, the libido is sexual, and that does not arise from a polarity of opposite, but from an object's non-identity with itself, producing an excess or lack depending on its relative nature, and that masculine and feminine are not opposites in polarity, but rather two logics which are separate from each other. Something like that. I think this reason for claiming Jung a new age obscurantist of Freud in relation to libido is also due to Zizek's reservation to conclude anything categorically due to the need for widespread data from diverse disciplines to explain in-depth phenomena, and that Jung went off course too much in the psychoanalytic realm. Many Lacanians critique Jung as advocating an ideal of wholeness, which refers to what I think may be Zizek's misunderstanding of Jung for calling him a new age obscurantist. Lacanians disagree with this idea of reaching wholeness because we are never whole, that we are always fragmented. This is true, but this is based on a misunderstanding of Jung's idea in relation to the union of opposite. It's not simply a union, but an alchemical concept. It's not about reaching a completed state of wholeness, it's about the ability to contain tension amongst fragmented parts of the self without disowning any of those fragments, so that from the tension arises something new. Incidentally, this is not true to the belief of wholeness or bliss, which is reached only by avoiding tension. This is the idea of the transcendent function, which Zizek might not actually be aware of, and is obviously not evident in Lacanian theory because it's Jungian. But as Zizek refers to Jung's theory saying, I quote, two polarities complementing each other, it does not incite the idea of Jung's belief in the production of something new or the production of something transcendent beyond its past self, which is why Jung referred to it as an alchemical and as a transcendent function. As I quote, Jung says, the secret of alchemy was in fact the transcendent function, the transformation of personality through the blending and fusion of the noble with the base components, of the differentiated with the inferior functions, of the conscious with the unconscious. End quote. He also rejects concepts of the unconscious from a Jungian perspective, resorting back to ideas of Freud and Lacan, saying, I quote, "As for the unconscious, the point made by the normativist Hegelians holds only for the 19th century Lebensphilosophy and for Jung, who resubstantialized the Freudian unconscious, but definitely not for Freud and Lacan. When Lacan repeatedly asserts that there is no big other, he means precisely that the unconscious is not an alienated substance determining subject. The Freudian unconscious is a name for the inconsistency of reason itself." End quote. So we can see that Zizek completely adopts the idea and concepts of Lacan and Freud in psychoanalysis. Jung's approach to the psyche is from a symbolist perspective, with focus on the archetypes which can be considered as transcendental categories, inherent in the psyche, unchanging in essence but varying in manifestation. Lacan's approach is also symbolist, but with a stronger emphasis on structuralism. In a way, Lacan considered Jung's view on the psyche's totality, as petrified and static. For a Jungian, it's not irrelevant to compare a patient's dreams with a mythological theme from a distant culture and draw conclusions from parallels. For strict Lacanians, this is a source of error, by not taking into account cultural and linguistic differences, with the view that a signifier has not a connection to one's signified occurrence in dream. Lacan is also more radical in his relativism than the semi-religious Jung. Also, the focus on linguistics and the psyche is very important for Lacan, as he saw that the unconscious is structured like language, in that Freudian slips and interpretation of dreams emphasized the agency of language in subjective constitution. Jung started thinking, which by the way caused this split between Freud and Jung, that the unconscious was something broader than a limited repository of repressed desires. Lacan was suggesting that the unconscious is in fact organized in terms of verbal expression, based on each individual instead of some kind of universal collective unconscious, which is Jung's magnum opus. Jung was thinking in terms of cognitive structures such as archetypes that precede verbal awareness, extending across cultures. Zizek's basic dislike of Jung then had to do with Jung's universal pre-verbal unity, which sounded much too metaphysical, vague and, as he says, new agey for him to tolerate, even when there is empirical data but also some potential scientific evidence for archetypal structures. This is the reason why he called Jung an obscurantist in relation to Freud with his ideas about libido, but he probably also meant that in relation to Jung's idea of the unconscious, which is why Zizek says in his book Disparities that the unconscious is not an alienated substance determining subject. The Freudian unconscious is a name for the inconsistency of reason itself. End quote. This negates Jung's theory that the unconscious is a collective of existing universal archetypes, which Freud, Lacan and Zizek would disagree with in regards to Jungian theory. With Zizek disregarding the ideas of Jung, he takes to Freud and Lacan for understanding the unconscious and the ego. Lacan tells us that the ego is an imaginary function. Our real subjectivity is something more, something greater than the illusions of the ego. The ego is an imaginary identity. It is trapped in the world of images or the imaginary, creating a struggle between our true but fragmented subjectivity and the spectral image we have of ourselves. Lacan's mirror stage demonstrates this as the ego being the result of a conflict between one's perceived visual appearance and one's emotional experience. This identification is what Lacan called alienation. At 6 months, the baby still lacks physical coordination. The child is able to recognize themselves in a mirror prior to the attainment of control over their bodily movements. The child sees their image as a whole, and the synthesis of this image produces a sense of contrast with the lack of coordination of the body, thus perceived in a fragmented form. The child's experience in contrast with their image is initially a rivalry, because the wholeness of the image threatens the child with fragmentation. Thus, the mirror image gives rise to an aggressive tension between the subject and the image. To resolve this tension, the child identifies with the image. This primary identification with the counterpart forms the ego. Zizek, in his book on Lacan, then goes into the concept of ego-ideal, ideal ego and superego, and that how these concepts mirror Lacan's triad of the imaginary, the symbolic and the other. If you don't know what these are, I recommend you look into them because you probably won't understand the following. Zizek says, I quote, in his book on Lacan, Freud uses 3 distinct terms for the agency that propels the subject to act ethically. He speaks of ideal ego, ego-ideal and superego. Lacan introduces a precise distinction between these 3 terms. Ideal ego stands for the idealized self-image of the subject, the way I would like to be, the way I would like others to see me. Ego ideal is the agency whose gaze I try to impress with my ego image, the big other who watches over me and impels me to give my best. The ideal I try to follow and actualize. The superego is this same agency in its vengeful, sadistic, punishing aspect. The underlying structuring principle of these three terms is clearly Lacan's triad, Imaginary-Symbolic-Real. Ideal ego is imaginary, what Lacan calls the small other, the idealized mirror image of my ego. Ego ideal is symbolic, the point of my symbolic identification, the point in the big other from which I observe and judge myself. Superego is real, the cruel and insatiable agency that bombards me with impossible demands and then mocks my botched attempts to meet them. The agency in whose eyes I am all the more guilty, the more I try to suppress my sinful strivings and meet its demands. Zizek identifies and accepts that there is a symmetry between the different complexes of ego with Lacan's triad of the imaginary, symbolic and the real. So there you go, I hope that was interesting. I went over some Lacan, Freud and Jung, but also Zizek's reasoning, which is that of what I know to be in the public sphere for why Zizek rejects Jungian ideas and concepts. But anyways, if you found it interesting, make sure to give it a like, comment your thoughts down below, subscribe, and if you want to support my channel, you can find my Patreon in the comments and description below. Thanks for watching.